When spring comes, there's always more work to do. Who cleaned the yard? Who was tidying up the vegetable garden? And who cleaned the living room, which stood a little away from the house? Since I was far from agriculture, I always ended up cleaning the garage or helping in other places. My mother-in-law, Margaret Adams, was busy in her favorite vegetable garden. As I approached the window overlooking the vegetable garden, I saw her standing on the path, leaning on a shovel, chatting with someone. From my vantage point, I couldn't see who it was, so I opened the window and sat in a chair to observe. Margaret always had a certain energy when she worked in the garden. It was as if the earth itself gave her strength, and she moved with an ease that seemed almost ageless. The fresh smell of earth and blossoming flowers was in the air, and birds chirped nearby. Margaret's voice came to me from the fence, but her words were inaudible. From her speech, however, I gathered that she was a neighbor, Paul, a young man who had dropped out of school early, after the 8th grade, and had attended a vocational school for a while before being expelled. Paul was a bit of an overgrown boy who never quite found his way, and his routine mostly revolved around the house, yard, and their vegetable garden, and occasionally he went to the village store across the street from our yards. Margaret was a widow, and perhaps in that respect she was a bit lonely. In conversation with Paul, she seemed cheerful, constantly shifting from foot to foot, giggling and shaking her head. "Paul, you're still young," she said modestly. "You'll find yourself a nice girl and everything will be fine." I couldn't make out Paul's reply, but whatever it was, Margaret laughed again. She looked around warily. "I'm a mistress." "Paul, I don't understand you. Are you serious? What if your mother finds out and gives you a scandal?" "I understand. I sympathize with you. But how can I help you?" "My time was 10 years ago," she said, though her tone seemed to soften. "I'll think about it, but you must remember that my daughter and son-in-law are here. And if your mother finds out about this, the whole village will know." With those words, she picked up the shovel and headed toward the barn. I quickly slipped out of the kitchen window and quietly went back into the house. Later, Margaret was sitting in the living room watching TV, but after a while she got up, got dressed, and said she was going to a neighbor's house. She went out and I watched her standing by the corner of the summer kitchen until Paul came over. They walked in together and I stepped back to the window, which I left slightly ajar. I couldn't see them since they didn't turn on the lights, but I could hear their voices. "So, are you ready, Paul?" asked Margaret softly. "Yes," he replied. She continued, "For me, it's just, well, that's about it." A few moments later, I heard Margaret say, "Good job. Take your time. It'll work out." This was followed by the creaking of the couch, which got louder and louder and finally quieted down. After about 10 minutes, it quieted down. I didn't wait for the second round of this invisible movie. I quietly moved back into the house, feeling a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed that the house was unusually quiet. The ticking of the clock in the living room seemed louder than usual, every second marking the strangeness of the evening. Margaret returned half an hour later and went straight to the bathroom. She looked flushed, but she didn't say anything to me, and I didn't bother to ask. I heard the sound of water pouring and wondered if she was trying to wash off what had just happened. As for me, I slid into bed next to Jenny and let my imagination run wild, pulling her to me. I remembered the scene in the summer kitchen, the words spoken in a whisper, and the creaking of the couch. The whole situation seemed surreal, like something out of a movie that was impossible to believe was real. Jenny flinched slightly when I put my arms around her, and her warmth brought me back to the present. I kissed her neck, and she murmured something unintelligible, half asleep. Thus began our night. The next morning, the usual spring bustle began again in the house. Margaret was up early, as if nothing had happened, and was already working in the garden. I watched her from the window, her purposeful movements as she tilled the soil. Paul was nowhere to be seen, and I couldn't help but wonder if he'd come by again. The air was crisp, the sun was shining brightly, and there was a sense of renewal in the air that spring always brings. Memories of the night before wouldn't leave my mind, but work was calling me, and I pushed them to the back of my mind. Later, as I was tidying up the garage, Margaret came in and asked if I needed help. Her face was as calm and her demeanor as smooth as ever. "No, I'm fine," I replied, watching her carefully. She nodded, but her eyes gave nothing away. It was as if the conversation with Paul, the secret meeting in the summer kitchen, had never happened. She went back to gardening, humming softly to herself, and I couldn't help but admire her composure. By evening, the sun had set, casting the yard in a golden light. Jenny and I sat on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze. Margaret was still in the garden, her silhouette visible against the fading light. She looked up at us and waved, her smile warm and genuine. I waved back, feeling a strange sense of normalcy. Everything that had happened the previous night seemed to have been hidden from view, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. And perhaps that was for the best. Some things were better left unspoken, buried in the quiet corners of our little village life.